Isn't a large part of nonviolent protest supposed to be intentionally putting yourself in positions for the state to enact violence upon you so the public can witness the violence of the state and force change? Yes, it is, which is why I've tried to be really frank when I've shared examples of effective nonviolent resistance in other countries. It's also why I made a video 11 months ago where I said that most Americans were at that time unaware of the level of sacrifice we would all have to make in order to stop this. And at the time I was thinking economic sacrifice more than sacrificing our bodies, but it was on my radar. At the time I was thinking like, we need big labor strikes, which I still believe in, right? I was thinking a Target boycott had just launched. I was like, that's a great first start, but like we need huge disruptive economic protest. We need huge boycotts with high levels of participation that can be sustained. Because gosh, we as the American consumers, there's so many more consumers than there are voters, right? Whole families can participate. Far more people buy shit and participate in the economy than vote in elections. We have huge amounts of power collectively when it comes to economic protest, boycott, disruption. Gosh, it requires a lot of self-control and sacrifice, and that's really hard in a consumer culture. So that's one of the things I was thinking of when I made that video, saying we're going to have to sacrifice a lot. Like, y'all need some radical acceptance about what we're going to have to sacrifice. At the time I made that video, I was frustrated because I was looking at Americans who were not willing to even experience discomfort, right? Who didn't want to give up their Saturday or didn't want to give up their fucking Starbucks, right? If you aren't willing to experience discomfort, then we're not going to be able to stop this. And so I was trying to get people accustomed to that idea of having to sacrifice. You have to risk it for a biscuit. You have to make sacrifices. We are investing in the future America that we want, an America with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, an America with just freedom and justice for all. And a point that I've just tried to drive home so much because I think Americans are really reticent to sacrifice very much. We don't like to feel discomfort. We don't like to have to give up very much. We've been conditioned by a highly consumer society for instant gratification, and that our comfort matters more than just about anything else. And like consumerism is the way to get that comfort, right? Likewise, we have been raised with this toxic individualism that says my comfort is more important than somebody else's safety or somebody else's fair pay, right? We unfortunately have more than 300 years of toxic individualism in our culture that is just like permeated everything, so that it's hard for us to be community minded. It's hard for us to think about giving up things personally for a greater cause, or even just like for our own future, right? We are able to sabotage our own future because the government, corporations have told us, like, just think about yourself. Think about your wants in the moment. And so I was frustrated with the lack of sustained economic boycott. I'm still frustrated, even though we've had some successful moves of Velo Airlines, Spotify, Disney. Like, okay, we need hugely disruptive economic measures. And also another way we can be really disruptive with the economy is labor strikes. So back then I was like, where are the labor unions? If all the teachers in the country walked off the job in 2 weeks, this would all be over. And I wasn't volunteering everybody else for that sacrifice, right? Like my spouse is a teacher. Our family is willing to engage in that sacrifice. But on top of the way that nonviolent resistance can be, must be highly disruptive economically, look at the women's suffrage movement. That was one of their key tactics, was disrupting commerce, disrupting businesses, and making a big public stink that cost the wealthy money, resulted in a loss of profit for rich men. You think rich men were going to be wanting to give rights to women on their own without disruption, without hitting them in the pocketbook? So yeah, economic disruptions, labor stoppages, boycotts, etc., hugely important. But there's this whole other layer to nonviolent resistance that I think a lot of Americans may not be that familiar with. Anybody involved in the civil rights movement, hugely familiar with it. Anybody involved in the ACT UP AIDS movement, hugely familiar with this. Anybody in the women's suffrage, women's rights movement, super familiar with this. And honestly, a fair amount of environmental activism as well, really familiar with the fact that the state is going to obligatorily be violent, especially if you are actually successful in disrupting what they're doing. They will be violent toward you. Right? That's why when I talk about civil disobedience, intentionally choosing to break an unjust law, that is a performance for the cameras. That's not something you do on a whim. It's not something you do impulsively. That is a planned sacrifice that is done with cameras ready. It is done, released to the press. You want maximum impact because those acts of civil disobedience are essentially a photo op. They are essentially propaganda for us that we are putting out to change hearts and minds. So much of the power of nonviolent resistance is creating this contrast between the cruelty, the brutality, the inhumanity of the regime versus us, regular, everyday, ordinary people who are entirely nonviolent, entirely reasonable. One of the most powerful examples of this is Sister Anne Rose in Myanmar. Very famous picture of her kneeling with her arms outspread and these young soldiers who have their weapons turned on her. And she's just kneeling and praying and asking them, please, please don't go chase down, right? They'd hidden some of her fellow sisters and residents of the village in a building, and she kneels in front of the soldiers and is pleading with them, please, please, please do not go kill them. And that act of nonviolent resistance was so incredibly powerful on two levels. One was that a photographer captured that image and it went all over the world, right? And became a symbol. It became a powerful, powerful image that showed the whole world how violent the regime was and how peaceful the people were, right? And a kneeling nun pleading for mercy. And then also right in the moment when that happened, these young men who had their guns trained on her, they were moved to tears. Some of them kneeled and prayed with her, laid down their weapons and said, we can't, look at this nun who's crying and pleading like we can't go along with this. And when we're looking at these photos and videos of what ICE is doing in Minneapolis and across the country right now, it creates that powerful contrast. This is where you get the backlash effect, where the regime becomes so brutal and oppressive in their crackdown that it could either cause the people to be scared into submission, into laying down and letting the authoritarian regime roll through, or those images can galvanize people, can activate people for the first time. That contrast between regular people, between moms being shot in the head and out of control, rage-filled ICE agents. This is where you get the brutality of the state to backfire on the regime, and it actually turns public support away from the regime and toward the people. It creates an opportunity for the regime to be portrayed to the world as extreme, out of control, and brutal, because that is what they are, right? Having that visual contrast highlights the reality of the situation for everybody. But it requires sacrifice. Somebody has to be willing to risk getting brutalized. This is why we have seen Pastor David Black, lots of pastors in Illinois in particular, have been willing to take up this role because they understand the power of nonviolent resistance. But we need to understand that nonviolent resistance is not peaceful from either side. It should be disruptive when we engage in it. The state will never be peaceful toward us. They will use any and every excuse to be violent. And so nobody should use, I don't personally think anybody should use the word peaceful when we are going out and doing the kind of work that we're doing right now, because the state will always be violent toward us. And we know that. So how can we use that to our advantage? And that requires people make some pretty hefty sacrifices, knowingly going into situations where they anticipate being harmed. They might not survive. They might go to prison. This past year, I read Reverend James M. Lawson's book, Revolutionary Nonviolence, which is about the American Civil Rights Movement, particularly organizing that was done in Tennessee. And one of the things that the Reverend says early in his book is that he was committed to being involved in the civil rights movement, but he didn't expect to live to see the age of 40. He expected to die doing that work. He was entirely committed to nonviolence. He was pretty sure that the state was going to kill him for it, or white people were going to lynch him. He says, in Nashville, some people wrote their wills as we proceeded to go on the freedom ride. We knew it was that bad. We knew it was that dangerous. And yet there was an extraordinary amount of courage that recognized that suffering and being injured is a part of any significant movement if you want serious change in the right direction.